Hi there, welcome. So excited to bring you the first attempt to have a podcast as a review for a COMSEP Journal Club article. Today I have with me Dr. Amit Pawa, who is Associate Clerkship Director at Johns Hopkins and a Med-Peds physician. And the article we'll be discussing is Does Educational Handover Influence Subsequent Assessment? It's by Valerie Dory, Deborah Danoff et al. And it's currently published in Academic Medicine ahead of print. And you can find the link in the email as well as in the notes. So we'll talk a little bit about this article. Amit, you want to tell us a little bit about what the purpose of this study was?
Yeah. So I think this was a great study to read, especially for those of us that are clerkship directors and are also may sense of a learning community. But it helps us to understand, is this educational handover where we may tell another faculty member, another assessor, how a student is doing prior to handing them off. So just like we have patient handoffs and saying that this patient's sick or not sick, it's almost thinking about that in a learner type of environment. And I think these guys did a good job of really trying to look at that question. I think it worries all of us, both as educators and learners, that does this feed forward something, or does it actually help the student or learner? We don't, and this was a good way to start answering that question. I don't think it finished answering the question, but I think it was a good way to start answering the question.
Excellent. All right. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how they did that study?
Yeah. And if you look at the methods, I think they did a great job of laying out the methods. If you ever to look at a paper as far as how to write methods, I think this is a good one to look at. So whoever was a senior author on this paper did a good job of mentoring the first person. But they essentially took these scripts and created scripts of two residents. So this was resident-based and not student-based. So I know a lot of our listeners are student educators, but it was for residents. And they had scripts for two residents that were essentially average for a first-year resident or beginning second-year resident. And they taped them interviewing a patient that was 17 years old so that it could cross different disciplines, right? So it could be whether it was pediatrics, medicine, surgery, in order to attract major. So this doesn't just apply to pediatrics, it's kind of learners of all flavors. And they did a really good job of standardizing everything. They made sure that the scripts were concordant. They actually got a third person to come in to check on those, make sure they were also graded well. And they eventually had these videos, and they distributed out to different people in these different departments, as I mentioned earlier. And they did a really good job of recruiting too. I like the word was partial deception that they use in this. It's an interesting way to recruit people, but essentially they didn't want to prime the people looking at the videos. And so they said, well, we're just doing this study to see how people are assessed. And they didn't really tell them too much, but they did let them know at the end, which I think that's important, right? Whenever you're doing these studies, you gotta let them know at the end. And I think only one person opted out at the end after that. And so they watched these videos and they divided them into three groups. One was the assessor just watched the video and graded the resident or assessed the resident both numerically and through comments. Then the second group was one where they got handed over things with medical knowledge. So they got an educational handover that told the assessor that there were some deficiencies in medical knowledge. And then they were allowed to watch videos. The third group was, they also received an educational handover, but this one focused more on communication deficiencies or communication issues. And so they were able to kind of assess the three different ways of nothing. Was it medical knowledge, or was it communication issues before they watched the video?
Excellent. So that's a great setup for the study with those three groups. And how did they analyze the data from the groups? What did they do then?
Yeah, so they did a couple different analysis. I think the more important analysis here, even though they looked at the numerical scores, was kind of the qualitative analysis, right? So looking at the comments, because I think that's really where most of us were worried, in that things would be dinged if someone were to get primed, unfortunately. And while the numerical scores are important, I think the comments were important too, because a lot of those go into evaluations. And it was a very interesting kind of finding after that, was that actually the numerical ratings and on these residents through Mini CX, which is kind of a validated tool, and a lot of physical exam findings is wasn't really that different, which was great, right? That so where we use a lot of our numerical ratings to help or to grade our students or to tier a student, I think that was nice to know that it wasn't changed that much. But I think the comments part where they went into a nice qualitative analysis, again, outlaid in the methods section and was done well, was a good finding. I think it was a really great finding for all of us that in the control compared to the controls, if you look at those that got the handover for medical knowledge deficiencies, really, again, the comments weren't that changed, but the part that was changed was in those that got the handover on communication deficiencies, and they were able in the comments to see more things written about the learner's communication skills and less about the medical knowledge information because they were primed to kind of think about those things and to observe on those things and make comments on those. So I think from both an assessor and a learner standpoint, it was really good because now you can actually see these are the areas I need to look at for the learner. And as a learner, I've now received areas that someone really took their time to look at.
Yeah. So in a way, it was almost the best of both worlds, right? Because you
Yeah.
have this study where students are worried about their grade. And apparently, in terms of the numerics, it didn't make any difference in terms of the grade, whether they were given forward information about a clinical or a communication deficiency at all. But if you were trying to make the student improve in their performance, then the areas where there was a concern, the assessor could give direct feedback that might be more helpful to them in terms of improving that. So, of course, that's kind of the whole goal of giving an educational handover in the first place, right? Is to help constrain or construct a setting where the student gets the information that's the most helpful for them. So, yeah, so excellent. So, what are the implications? How do you think this will change your experience as an educator?
Yeah. So, John, I think it doesn't change too much of what I do. I pretty much practice this way a lot of times, but I think it reaffirms. So I think there's a lot of stuff in evidence where maybe you were already doing it, but now it reaffirms what you're doing. So this really affirms. But I think for some people, it will actually make them more likely to feed forward information, especially if they're changing services and the students are not. We live in a situation where there's a lot of turnover in both faculty and residents that, and then those sometimes don't align with the student schedule, unfortunately. And so I think this provides an opportunity to say that maybe it's something that we should be doing and reaffirm that those who do it. And again, as you mentioned before, I think it's great for students or learners in general, because now they can say, oh, they always say like the comments are not very helpful. I'm sure you've gotten that feedback too, is that, oh, I don't really know what these comments would help me with. And I think now they can get targeted comments, it goes back to what you said, this is really good for students. And I think that, we should be more intentional about now, just like we hand over our patients. Like if, you're on call at night, John, and I'm handing over my service to you and I say, this patient is sick, or this patient is going to need a lot of work overnight, or this patient is going to be fine overnight. We should also say that about students, right? I mean, obviously it wouldn't be the same terminology as we would use with patients, but we should talk about like, student A has a little bit of deficiencies in medical knowledge, and this one, is not as good at using family-centered language, and this one, is unable to, read without notes. And so that way, when you're going and looking at them after I've done assessing them, you can say, well, these in your mind, you can say, these are things that Amit told me, and now I know what to look for in these students.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it really sort of, as pediatricians, it sort of very much fits into our mindset of sort of, developmental milestones, right? Yeah. Students are tracking along a path, and every student is at a different place along that path. And having information about where they need a little bit more attention helps you in terms of gearing your attention towards that area and helping them develop that area. And I think that's really good for students. Of course, as you sort of alluded to, the student's main concern is always about, is this going to affect my grade, the so-called halo horn effect, right? Where if someone has negative feedback around a particular area, then the person who gets that feedback is going to be more likely to see that behavior. What do you think about that in light of this study?
Yeah, and I've often had students, I think it was just recently about a month ago, where a student was concerned that I gave a formative feedback form from one attending to another attending, but it actually helped out that attending be able to say like, well, these are things you weren't doing well at the early in your clerkship, and now you are doing well in your clerkship. But the student was worried because they felt like that faculty member was going to grade them poorly based on being biased from another faculty member. And I was able to say to the student, you know what, there's actually evidence now that shows that that may not be the case. So I think now we can, as clerkship directors and, learning community leaders, or whatever role we have in helping students and getting them through medical school, I think we can say this to them, like, you should really pride on getting more feedback, right? Like we always tell the students, get feedback. The LCME says that, they need new clerkship feedback, but I think this actually says that you do need feedback, and the feedback will make you better and will get you almost a better evaluation, right? At the end, a more like individualized evaluation than you would with just getting the read more kind of generic evaluation that we always see.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The only sort of caveat I'd give to that is that, as you pointed out, really well done study, very well designed, with mixed methods using qualitative and quantitative analysis. Everything was well controlled with 3 groups. So a very, very careful study, which led to a very high confidence in the internal validity of the study. But this is a video, and so there's no stake really for the assessors, for the faculty, in terms of what they say. It may be different in the real world, where there's students or others pressuring them in one direction or the other, right? And so I think this needs, although it's very reassuring, it probably needs some follow-up in a real world setting to make sure that this still applies in real world settings.
Yeah, John, I agree with you. I almost liken this to a drug study, right? There are phases. And as I said earlier, this started the question, and I think did a good job of beginning the answer for the question, but I don't think it's the end of the question. Obviously you're right, this is a video. We all know that residents aren't graded. They're assessed, but they don't receive an honors high pass or pass like a lot of our students do, or some type of tiered grading system. And so I think that with just like anything, you got to start the question. I think they started it, answered a little bit of it, but now I think it behooves a lot of us in medical student education and maybe even resident education to kind of test this out in the real world, where people who are assessing may be a little, not say biased, but are going to act differently, right? Because they're in a real world setting as opposed to watching a video. I think a lot of our faculty members, and I think you get this too when you were clerkship director and even now, are worried. And every now and then, like once a month, I get a resident like, I don't want to give them a bad evaluation because I think it's going to hurt their grade. So I think there's a lot of concern from an assessor standpoint that they're going to hurt the student's grade. And so I think there may be a little bit of what we call, they may not assess as like they normally would. And so I think we really do need to test this. I think it would be hard because we do not want to affect the student's grade, right? Like if we were to do something, so we would have to make sure that this was something that would be set aside from the student's grade. I think, can it be done? I think it can be, but I think again, it would have to be well designed and make sure we don't affect the student's grade.
Excellent. Well, thanks for bringing this study to our attention, Amit. It's been a great discussion, and I hope that everyone who's listening has enjoyed it, and hope that you can give us some feedback about it. Again, if you want to find the article, you can look at the COMSEP Journal Club email, or you can look at the notes underneath the recording and look at it yourself. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.